Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So we are attempting to understand the Mishna of Rabbi Yosi. Last share, and apologies for the cancellation, late notice cancelling Tuesday. Last share, we began discussing what does the Mishnah mean when it says Kol HaKelim Netolin, Chutz Mei the Mesa Godel, and Yosi Shamachrisha. I mean, there's many kelim which are Muktza. And we said that all other kelim which we call Muktza, I Klisha Melachta Le'issa, are Muktza in the sense that you can't move them, at least according to Rabbi Huda, just move them for Gufay and the Tzorech Mekayimai. Why can you move them, let's say, the Tzorech Gufay? Because they're a keli. Keli is omid for example, to be used for malacha, but it's a keli, and therefore it's also omid for any other use you can put it to. And if you wish to use this hammer to crack nuts, that's it's omid for that, and therefore you can use it l'tzorech gufay. Whereas these kelim are unique, and a variety of others that the Gemara lists, in not being nittel, not being omid for other use. And Tosfos spells this out. He said, "Shemakbid your makbid, you're careful they shouldn't be damaged, and therefore also the taltal shelo the taltal afilu l'tzorech gufay." That's the language of Tosfos and the Masechet Sakina. It can't even be moved l'tzorech gufay. And we saw the Rambam also seems to say that he lists in Perek Chafhei the first 8 halachas basically, that he talks about Klisha Melachto Le'issa, and he says they are mutter l'tzorech gufay and l'tzorech mekayimai. And then in Halacha Tes, he brings the din of Muktza Machmas Chisaron kiss, and there he doesn't mention anything about being allowed to move them l'tzorech gufay and l'tzorech mekayimai. And I think we discussed this last time. Now, I'm just going to mute everyone. Okay. Now, I don't want to go too far into this because of avoiding being overwhelmed with information. But I mentioned, I think briefly last week, that there is a machlokus, and we've sort of alluded to it several times. There is a machlokus, Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Shimon, around Muktza, a very large-scale machlokus. And the machlokus, it's presented as if Rabbi Shimon holds there's no such thing as Muktza. Rabbi Shimon doesn't hold a Muktza. What this really means is he has a much more limited definition of Muktza. There are Rishonim who believe that our Mishnah is going like Rabbi Shimon, and that's why it says Kol HaKelim Netalin. All kelim can be moved. And they believe that Rabbi Shimon holds that a Klisha L'Issa is not Muktza at all, or at least barely Muktza, and can be moved Mechama L'Tel. Again, so just to explain this point, we've so far learned, based on the first Mishnah of our Perek, that a Klisha Melachta is the first thing we learned is that the term Muktza is not such a useful term when we're learning these halachas, because Muktza means lots of different things. A Klisha Melachta L'Issa is Muktza in the sense that you can't just move the keli for its own sake. Mechama L'Tel means to protect it from sunlight, to move it into the shade. But you can move it l'tzorech gufay if you want to use it for a mutter use, and that was the first mission of Kornus, this hammer that can be used for mutter uses. There is another opinion out there, Rabbi Shimon, who arguably holds that Klisha Melachta L'Issa, since it is a kli, all said and done, can be moved mechama l'tzel. If that's so, then our Mishnah, if it's going like that, may simply mean that that Muktza Machmas Chisaron kiss, even Rabbi Shimon would agree, is not such a kli, and therefore it cannot be moved mechama l'tzel. And we don't have evidence in Rabbi Shimon that he means l'tzorech for l'tzorech mekayimai. So I just mentioned that to say that at least in the simplest reading, the halacha, there's no way of avoiding this conclusion. Like Tosfos, that when the Mishnah says not nitolin, it means that the Klisha Melachta L'Issa, Muktza Machmas Chisaron kiss, cannot be moved l'tzorech gufay. You could, though, learn the Mishnah completely and radically differently, and learn that it's all it's saying is it can't be moved mechama l'tzel. I just mentioned that for the sake of thoroughness. I hope have I confused. Is this reasonably clear? Okay, if not, I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. Just trying to explain it once more. And if not clear, the truth is you can forget these last comments. It's not essential to what we're saying. Is the heter only is the Issam, only l'tzorech gufay, or even l'tzorech makomay. So Muktza machmas chasaron kis cannot be moved l'tzorech gufay. Tosfos says that clearly. Can it be moved l'tzorech makomay? So the Beis Yosef really argues from 3 proofs and more that Muktza machmas chasaron kis cannot be moved l'tzorech makomay. And broadly, his proof is as follows. Number 1, Tosfos says afilu, which he understands to mean it can't be moved even for tzorech gufay, kal v'chomer not for tzorech makomay. Number 2, the Rambam we mentioned before doesn't mention any exceptions to the Muktza of Chisaron Kis, unlike the earlier halachas in the same chapter, implying that the tzorech gufay and the tzorech makomay is an allowance for Klisha melachot l'issa, but not in the least an allowance for Chisaron Kis, and therefore Chisaron Kis is forbidden both for tzorech gufay and tzorech makomay. And his third argument is that it is a kal v'chomer of sorts. If tzorech gufay is asa, kal v'chomer, tzorech makomay is asa. And there's 2 sources for assuming that if tzorech gufay is asa, then tzorech makomay is asa. The first is really the continuation of our Gemara of an Abaya, in which the Gemara seems to say that tzorech gufay is more asa than tzorech makomay. Now, Rava doesn't, or tzorech gufay is a lesser, an easier allowance than tzorech makomay. Rava doesn't necessarily agree it's an easier allowance, but at least he equates the 2. So it's reasonable, says the Beis Yosef, to assume if Chisaron Kis forbids tzorech gufay, then kal v'chomer forbids tzorech makomay. The other source for this idea is Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph, just an Amud ago, in which we saw Nehemiah, who said that Kol HaKedim, any Kedim can be only taken the Tzorech Tashmisham for their primary purpose. And then the Gemara says Hakol Modim and so on and so forth. And then we got to Zeri, Missouri, given the Kopid Alay, Miyachid Lumakom. And there, the Gemara seemed to imply that the most fundamental quality of Chisaron Kis, of Kli, that Muktza machmas chasaron kis, is that you're meyachid makom, you don't move it around so that it doesn't get damaged. And therefore the essence of this point is that you don't move it around, and therefore it's also in tzorech makomay, kal v'chomer l'tzorech gufay. That's the more or less the shape of the structure of how this argument goes. So far I haven't really gone into Svaros. In a moment we'll have to unpick Svaros. But just to summarize what we're saying, we have a Mishna that says Hakol nitolin, Kedim can be moved besides Chisaron Kis. That's the summary of our Mishnah. What's the besides? What can't it be moved for? The Rishonim, Tosfos and others seem to say that Klisha melachot l'issa can be moved l'tzorech makomay. We saw that earlier. A cornice which is Muktza, Klisha melachot l'issa. Nonetheless, if you find a use for it, you can use it. Chisaron is unique in that you can't use it. Tosfos says explicitly tzorech gufay, and then Joseph assumes who had in tzorech makomay. So if you equate, and maybe this equation is not a good one, if the Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud and the Mishna Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud base are the same essence, or an essence, a critical quality of Klisha melachot l'issa is that you are miyachid mokum for it, and therefore it's also the tzorech makomay. That's what the Gemara says. In which case you see that tzorech makomay is certainly also in the issa of Chisaron Kis.
It's not the Kuf Gimel or Muktza machmas chasaron kis type things. They're not those Zairi, etc. were specific things.
I'll come to that in a second, but for now I'm saying if we equate the examples of the Gemara in Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph with the Mishnah in Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Beis, and we say they are both types of Muktza machmas chasaron kis, then you see that the non-movability is a critical feature of the fact that it's not omei to be moved. These are kelim where the default set. Again, if we understand Muktza to be something that isn't muchon on Erev Shabbos and hasn't been satisfied with something, can't change its hachana. So the reason why something is Muktza is because it wasn't satisfied for that use. So a stone, for example, is Muktza machmas gufay. It's just got no use at all. You could create a use for a stone. You could begin using it as a paperweight in Shabbos, but that's exactly what Muktza says, which is don't give it this new functionality. So if the essence of Chisaron Kis is it's the sort of thing that you don't move around, moving it around is giving it a new functionality. It's a chiddush to change its place. Therefore, it would obviously be Muktza that you couldn't move it around to tzorech makomay. And that seems to be what the Gemara, if we assume, we'll come to Adam's point in a minute, but if we assume that Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph and the Gemara and our Mishnah of Chisaron Kiss are identical halachas, or our Mishnah without even labeling Chisaron Kiss are identical halachas, then we see that integral to the definition of this type of Muktza is that it's also the Torah Makomi, that you can't move it around. Yeah.
How can we learn it from Torah? Because the basis is the Torah Makomi. Maybe Torah Makomi you could move it.
But the basis argument is since Tosfos tells us that you can't move it to Torah Makomi, Kal V'chomer and Torah Makomi.
How does that work? If the basis is
that's a question on Tosfos, but Tosfos somehow knew that it's also the Torah Makomi. So the Beis Yosef, as a posek, coming on later, says if the Beis Yosef says it's also the Tzorech Gufay, then Kal V'chomer and Tzorech Makomi, because the Tzorech Makomi in Rav and Abai later you see is at least equal, if not more, than Tzorech Gufay. And in the Gemara Aliyah, you see also that integral to the concept of Muktza Machmas Sankis is the immovability and Tzorech Makomi. That's the Beis Yosef's logic. Okay, in the simple summary of the 3 points of Beis Yosef, there's just piles that we need to untangle, and I'm conscious what I'm saying is quite confusing. I'm just trying to summarize the state of play in the classic sources. But let's sort of try and take a deep breath and step back. And in fact, because you've picked on this, and as I mentioned, let's start with Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph and Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Beis. So ostensibly, Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph, the Gemara there, and Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Beis, our Mishnah, are really talking about two different types of scenarios. Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph talks about these implements, Sichi, Zeri, and Mazori, whether they're used for dyeing or whether they're used for weaving. There's some form of quite delicate implement. And the Gemara says that since you're kopid alayu, miyachid mokum. So it's explicit that the point is yichud mokum. In our Mishnah, it doesn't really mention anything about yichud mokum. Now, you could say because it's a Mishnah and it's not explaining its reasoning, it doesn't mention anything about the reason, but it's not obvious to squeeze Yichud Mokum into the Mishnah at all. More than that, the Gemara and Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph quotes this memra of Sichi, Zeri, and Mazori in the name of an Amora, Rav, and it wanted to bring out an example of Hakol Moedim, where everyone would agree to Rab Nechemiah that you can't move a keli for any other purpose. If the Gemara meant by that memra to equate it to our Mishnah of Rabbi Yosi, why did the Gemara not reference the Mishnah rather than the Amora? Now, there could be good answers to that question. You could, for example, say that the Mishnah isn't a raya that Hakol Moedim because it's just the memra of one Tana Rabbi Yosi. Whereas when you're bringing it from Rav, you see the halacha like that Mishnah and the like. So you could find various answers to the question. But again, it's not obvious in the Gemara that these two sugyas are synonymous. We saw already last week that Rashi does seem to cut and paste terminology from that sugya to our sugya. And therefore, at least Rashi would seem to understand that these sugyas are synonymous. So in the very parish of Rashi on our Mishnah, Rashi says, and that's a direct quote from the Gemara in Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph. So it seems Rashi puts the two sugyas together. So if we put the two sugyas together, then and somehow resolve the other difficulties about why the Gemara doesn't reference the Mishnah there and why the terminology alters, what turns out is that between these two sugyas we have one new type of Muktza, which we're labeling Chisaron Kiss, but maybe that's a good shorthand label or not, but let's just use that shorthand label of things where you are makbid and therefore you don't move them, and therefore integral to this Muktza is that you don't move them. Now, what's the relationship between these two qualities? Is it that you are makbid because they're very expensive or very delicate, therefore you don't move them? Or could it even be freestanding? If you have things which you wouldn't move ever, even though not because they're particularly valuable or sensitive, but there's just not the sort of thing that you move, the same halacha could apply. Or is it possible that you could have delicate things that you do move, in which case the halacha wouldn't apply? All that we need to work out, and we will need to work through all of that. So just to summarize so that we're not hopefully confused in all of this. We have a Gemara in Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph, which defines whatever's being discussed there as makbid and miyachid l'mokum. We have a Mishnah on Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Beis, which tells us about other kelim which are completely muktzah. And if we equate the two as Rashi does, and therefore we'll go with that, it's useful in terms of our halachic knowledge because now we can cross-transfer halachas, and it would seem that integral to Chisaron Kiss is the immovability. However, we have to ask ourselves, what is the relationship between the two qualities? You have an item which you are makbid on, you are particular about, and as a result, you're miyachid mokum. What makes it into this new category of Muktza? What is the critical element? Is it the miyachid mokum, that you wouldn't move it, and makbid is just the means to getting to the yichud mokum? In which case, if you had other reasons why you don't move things, that would also be this category of Muktza. Maybe the critical, and the yichud mokum is just what happens to be the case. And maybe you could have something which you're makbid on, which you would move, which would still be Chisaron Kis. So whenever you have two definitions given for something, we always end up in a bit of a tangle. What's the critical definition? What's the relationship between these two qualities? Is it cause and effect? Is it that both happen to be here and you need both conditions? One condition without the other be sufficient? All of that needs exploration. But that's a summary if you put the two Gemaras together. And if you do put the two Gemaras together, then it's explicit that Tzorech Mekomo should be Osa rather than just Tzorech Gufo, because in a sense the essence of it is Tzorech Mekomo. If anything, maybe the other way around. Maybe Tzorech Mekomo is more obvious than Tzorech Gufo.
Can we say
so? That's yeah, Max.
Sorry, I just think maybe it's by the butter swallow, but can you say that since people are kind of careful to put things in their place, or most people, then it's not necessarily just something very expensive that you're going to put in its place. So that's not such a crucial element in what's going on. I mean, people put back knives and forks in cutlery drawers, so they're not expensive.
Okay, so two points, Max. The first point is that the point over here is not that people put things in their place. We all tidy up, or hopefully we tidy up and put things back where they belong. The point is that you leave it in its place. Yes, you put a knife and fork back in the cutlery drawer when you finish using it, but you're not miyachid u'mokum. You then take it out and you put it out on the table in order to have a meal, and you might leave it out on the table for a long time. You move these things around constantly. That happens to be convenient to have them out of the way when you don't want them. But when you do want them, you move them around easily and casually without thinking about it. Whereas the unique quality of these kalim is that you don't move them around casually. That's the first point. The second point is, and I'm being a bit pedantic here, but to make this point, just to bring out the point, you phrased your question as could you say, and the answer is of course you could say, meaning it's certainly possible to disentangle makbid and mokum. Our question is whether it's correct to disentangle them or not. The Gemara says copied, therefore miyachid u'mokum. And we're asking your question, which is, are both elements critical over here, or could you disentangle them? And you can find many scenarios where you have copied without yichud mokum, or yichud mokum without copied. And we'll look at real life examples later. And it's going to be a real question whether these are things which are Muktza machmas and kiss. I mean, we have, I think, quite a good modern example of this phenomena. A phone is an exceptionally expensive item. A smartphone can cost several £100s. I think it's one that we would very reluctantly use for any other shtamshus. I don't think we would use it as a door stopper or casually use it to break a nut with or something like that. They're not super strong devices. And yet we're not miyachid u'mokum. We move them around constantly. That's the whole point of it. So it's a really interesting shaila. Halacha l'maisa, is a phone a klisha melachot issa, or is it Muktza machmas Chisaron Kis? And there'll be enormous nafkaminas in this. We have a security team here in the shul, as every shul does, and we quite easily allow them to carry phones around because sadly, and so on, maybe we're treating it as, can you move your phone around on Shabbos? If you need the place, if you have your phone plugged in charging, you can't unplug it. If you're just sitting on the sideboard on your table, can you move it? There's a whole array. Obviously, you can't stun move a phone, but there's a need. I should speak with more care. I'm just rushing through security halacha, so maybe I backpedal a bit from that need to. But when there's a proper need, we don't treat it as Chisaron Kis. Even where it's not cross the threshold of pikuach nefesh, there's an interim level, which is an appropriate halachic category over here. But let's unravel from security reasons. Just one thing: you come Shabbos and you want to set the table, and you suddenly realize you left your mobile phone there. Is it klisha melachot issa? Is it Chisaron Kis? So, Max, in answer to your question, you can say anything, almost anything. But the question here is, what is the integral logic of the Gemara? And again, my first point I want to reiterate, which is, it's not the point that you just tidy things up and put them in their place. That's not what yichud mokum means. It means you're miyachid mokum. You uniquely specifically single out a place for them to stay, and you don't casually and flippantly move them around. That's the critical element. Okay, so this is just
sorry, one more, is it that they stay in that place?
They're left in the place unless there's something changes which makes you move it, as opposed to knives and forks, which are made to be moved around.
So the malacha that you do is actually in that place the whole time normally. If you
okay, here you're moving us on to something else, which is the malacha you do may not be in that place, but you would only move them for the malacha. And since it's a malacha to do this on Shabbos, therefore it's not only to be moved. Again, Max is running us into something else, which I hadn't wanted to yet get into. There's another major confusion over here, which is, can I put your question on hold? Because I just don't want us to get tangled into confusion or thoughts. I'll come to the question next year, Bellini. Okay? Well, all I'm going to say is, for now, I'm being told my internet connection is unstable. Are you able to hear me, Max? You're muted, but on and off.
Yeah, it's flickering a bit, but it's
Okay, but it's okay. Fine. Okay, apologies.
Managed to
okay, so let me just summarize what we said so far. And I'm going to put your question on hold just for reasons of convenience, just to avoid us getting overwhelmed. Let me one model. Let's step back even further. If we equate Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph with Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Beis, there's two pieces of clarity that we emerge with. The second piece of clarity we emerge with is what we're talking about in this Shiur, which is that integral in some shape or form to the concept of Muktza Machmas Chisaron Kis is Yichud Makom, because the Gemara mentions it explicitly there, and Rashi cuts and pastes it to our Mishna over here, in which case you couldn't move Chisaron Kis, the Sof Kufa, the Sof Makomo, though we are left with a project of working out the relationship between copied and Mokum, but we know that both are elements of this halacha. The first bit of clarity we emerge with is a convenient way of thinking about Muktza Machmas Chisaron Kis, and this is something I want to speak about. The Gemara brought there an opinion called Reb Nechemia. Reb Nechemia said Kanim can only be moved for what's the language? Ein Kanim nitzel elo l'sorech tashmisho. They can only be moved for their tashmish. In other words, Reb Nechemia says you have a pen, it's tashmish's writing. You have a hammer, a blacksmith hammer, it's tashmish's blacksmithing. Kanim have a tashmish. You can move and use them on Shabbos for their tashmish if it's a mutter thing, and you can't use and move them on Shabbos if it's an asa tashmish. The chiddush of those who argue on Nechemia is that all kanim are omeid for all tashmishim. And therefore, even though a pen or a hammer is primarily for its tashmish, nonetheless, if another convenient tashmish comes along, you can use it for that, because kanim are human servants. Kanim are omeid for our use. If you had something which wasn't a keli, there we would all agree with Nechemia that it's not omeid for all sorts of other uses, and that's what we call Muktza Machmas Gufo, a stone, a piece of scrap metal, a piece of scrap wood. It's not a keli, and therefore it's not omeid for use, and therefore you can't use it on Shabbos for any new use on Shabbos is innovating use as opposed to it being omeid for that use, and therefore it's Muktza. Is this correct? Okay. On that, the Gemara says Hakol Moedim, and Rashi translates even the Rabbanon of Nechemia agreed to Nechemia that you're right. Ein chinitl elo l'sorech tashmisho. A keli can only be used for its tashmish when it comes to what we're now calling Muktza Machmas Chisaron Kis. So a way of thinking about Muktza Machmas Chisaron Kis is it's a way of making a keli into a stone. Normal kalim are omeid for all tashmishim. Muktza Machmas Chisaron Kis is only omeid for its tashmish, because you wouldn't use it for any other tashmish, because it's a sensitive item. Therefore, it's only omeid for its tashmish, and its tashmish is mutter on Shabbos, is muktzah on, is osur on Shabbos, and melachot on Shabbos, because you can't, do shechita on Shabbos. Therefore, this keli, with respect to all other tashmishim, is not omeid for any other function, and therefore, in effect, it's a stone. Or to put it differently, we answered our question about whether and why it's osur l'sorech kufa l'sorech makomai, and the answer is because it comes back to being a stone. Just as a stone is muktzah, and you can't move it l'sorech kufa l'sorech makomai, similarly, a Muktza Machmas Chisaron Kis is like a stone, and you can't move it l'sorech kufa l'sorech makomai, because hakol moedim, everyone agrees to Nechemia that this chiddush, that all kalim are omeid for all uses, doesn't apply with these kalim. That's the sort of clarity you get by merging the two sukkahs together. So, just to summarize what we've said so far, there's a sukkah in Kuf Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph, which in a way is clearer than our Mishnah because it's an Amora and he explains more what he's saying. And in that statement, you see Hakol Moedim to Nechemia. you see that it's because copied, and you see it's because miyachad lu makom, and therefore putting them all together, we get quite a clear picture of what the logic behind Chisaron kiss is. It's because it's not omitted for any other tashmishim, and it's also l'tzorech gufa l'tzorech mekomo, and the two sugyas are merged. Rashi indeed, I think Rashi merges the two sugyas, and he directly cuts and pastes from the phraseology of that sugya to explain our Mishnah. That's the sort of first sort of point I wanted to bring out on the sugya. Is everyone with me here? Is this clear? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Anyway.
The Rashi on
Yes.
So it's leading the Rashi tomorrow as well.
Yes.
When he says that you're he says, and therefore maximum given. So the common thing seems to be not whether you're nothing, but whether you're maximum given.
Yes. So this is important here in terms of unpicking what happens if you have one quality or not the other. Is miyachad u'makom just a means to an end, or is it the quality, the feature in its own right? And could you have another route to being your time also? So we'll get back to these Rashis, very, very important Rashis, when we try and disentangle. But for now, before we go to that level of depth, you do see that seemingly, at least in the simplest form of Chisaron kiss, is making it modular on the chamia. It makes it like a stone, and the yichud makom seems to be an integral feature of it. Yeah. Okay. So this is one way of reading the Gemara. You could argue quite the contrary, and you could argue that l'tzorech gufay is more obvious than l'tzorech makomai. And the Gemara that seems to make a kal v'chomer between if something's also l'tzorech gufay, the Gemara later on in our Amud, kal v'chomer is also l'tzorech makomai. At least Abaye says that kal v'chomer and Rava equates them. Is in that scenario, but can't be automatically transferred to our sugya, and on the contrary, zil basatama, you have to follow the reasons. Let me explain what I mean. If you have a kli shemalachto le'isa, a hammer, is it more? You definitely can't move it. Halacha, that means, according to Rabbi Huda, not Rabbi Shimon, you can't move it mechama l'tzel. You can't move it from the sun to shade. Why can't you move it from the sun to the shade? Why not? Because its primary purpose is issa. It's a hammer. It's a blacksmith's hammer. Why can you move it to tzorech gufay? Because of what we just saw, that we don't hold like from the chamia, and we hold that all kelim have secondary uses for which they are made for, which you can use them for. So that means to say that the primary use of the keli determines that it's a kli shemalachta l'isa, therefore you can't move it mechama l'tzel. The secondary use of the keli, the fact that it still is omed for all tashmishim, is enough to allow you to use it for tzorech gufay. What about tzorech makomo? Can you use it for tzorech makomo? So it's not at all obvious that tzorech makomo should be allowed, even if tzorech gufay is allowed. Tzorech gufay is allowed because I'm using it for a mutter use. I'm using this hammer for cracking a coconut. That's a mutter use. Tzorech makomo, is that called a mutter use of the keli or not? If I'm moving it mechama l'tzel because I want to protect the keli, we said it's also because the keli is primarily for a melacha. If I'm moving it because I want the space of the keli, in a sense I'm using it for a mutter use because I'm not moving it because I want the keli. I'm moving it because I want the space of the keli. But is it obvious that that's the same as tzorech gufay? Tzorech gufay, I'm in a sense relating to this keli in its non-muktza capacity. When I'm moving it to tzorech makomo, am I relating to the keli in its non-muktza capacity? Not really. I'm not relating to the keli at all. I'm just moving the keli to get the mokum of the keli. Is mokum place a feature or an aspect of an object? Is a quality of an object that has a mokum? How does the space of something, it's almost a philosophical question, how does the space of something relate to the object? Is an attribute or quality of the object? Again, a kli shemalachta l'isa, I can't move mechama l'tzel just to protect the kli. I can't move the hammer to protect it. Why? Because the hammer's primary purpose is something forbidden on Shabbos. Why can I move the hammer like us, not like from Nehemiah, in order to crack a coconut? Because I'm using the tishtamshus of the hammer for a mutter use, and this is not a chiddush. I'm not innovating new tishtamshus, because it was always omed as a secondary use to crack nuts. But to move it to tzorech makomo, maybe yes, maybe not. On the one hand, it's a keli. Kelim are dedicated to serving humans. Surely if I need to move the keli to free up the space, that's a type of serving me and I should be allowed to move it. On the other hand, you could argue that I'm moving it I'm not moving the keli for a use of the keli. freeing up the space is not a legitimate use of the keli. It's a legitimate thing to want to do. It's not a legitimate use of the keli. Who says it's only made for tzorech makomo? So you can see why, in a sense, the heter of tzorech makomo is a bit more of a forced heter than the heter of l'tzorech gufay. That's in terms of the broadest brushstroke svara, in terms of the broadest way of looking at things. Max, I'm just going to mute you for a minute just because of noise interference. I'll when you want to ask, I'll come back to you in a few minutes. So that's in the broadest brushstroke svara. However, when we think about Muktza, Machmas, Chisaron, Kiss, you could argue the svara the other way around. And let's follow the logic. If the essence of Muktza, Machmas, Chisaron, Kiss is that I'm careful with them not to do anything else, which is where things seem to start, that I'm makbid on them because they're delicate and they can easily get ruined, then using them to move seems less of an innovation than using them for another use. In which case you could argue exactly the opposite. So if Gufay is also because I use them for another use, but moving them, I would move them if I need the space. So the kal v'chomer of if something's also the tzorech gufay, kal v'chomer is also the tzorech makomo, makes sense with regular kelim where we're trying to work out to what degree it's also. But if the essence of chisaron kiss is the hakbada, that they shouldn't get damaged and I wouldn't use them for anything else, then is this equation so simple? Who says that just because I'm makbid not to move them? And let's again take a real life example. If I have a very expensive vase, right? So I wouldn't use it for anything else ever. I'm not going to casually use it as a paperweight and so on. I would never use it l'tzorech gufay for some other use. Would I move it around? Yeah, maybe I would move it around. If there's some reason why I need that space, then I'll move it somewhere else, as long as I'm careful with it. I'm careful with it, but moving a space isn't a contradiction to care. I'm careful about moving it, but doesn't mean I don't move it. It's Shamila. It's moved around. I'm careful with that. I would never use my Shamila to slice my cucumbers for my sandwich because I don't want to damage it, but it doesn't mean I wasn't using it as well. It doesn't mean I wouldn't move it around somewhere else. So the theoretical question we sort of started with in, let's say, Rashi, where you've got the kopit alayu on the one hand, on the other hand, therefore I don't move it, and then maybe a third line in the equation, therefore I'm up to it, and we're asking about the relationship between the three. If you follow svara, it does seem more intuitive to say that something should be Muktza, that Chisaron Kiss should be Muktza, the tzorech gufay, but arguably allowed the tzorech makomo. So I'm trying to argue in brief that the Gemara later, which seems to say that Muktza makomo is a kal v'chomer from the tzorech gufay, is not necessarily applicable with Chisaron Kiss. Again, just to summarize, we have a kli melachot l'issa. If a kli melachot l'issa, can it be used for other legitimate uses, for mutter uses? Can the hammer be used to crack a coconut? The chiddush of those arguments. Does that mean it can also move the tzorech makomo? That's a bigger chiddush. And therefore the Gemara correctly says, Gemara doesn't need my agreement, but I understand why the Gemara says that if tzorech gufay is also kal v'chomer, tzorech makomo is also. And that's when we're looking at with stam kelim what they're omeid for. They're less muktzah with respect to a legitimate use of the keli than when I'm just moving it from place to place. But the unique feature of Chisaron Kiss is it's dependent on my hakbada, on my particularity. To what degree I'm makbid on things. When it comes to hakbada, if anything, the equation swings the other way around, and it's more likely that I'm makbid the tzorech gufay than the tzorech makomo. I just, as I was speaking, glanced at the clock and realized I've gone 4 minutes. I apologize, I got caught up in this. So I'll leave you with that thought and yes. No, it's not so clear, and this gets to Max's point earlier and Ansel's point, and no, the Von may be a poor example because it's a kli melachot l'heter, and we'll come to that. Yes, can a kli melachot l'heter also be a chisaron? We'll get to that. Yes, that'll be the next one we know. Okay, we'll stop here because I've gone over time. Forgive me, and please, God, we will resume.